Hello, everyone. I am Dr. April Aydın, the Chairman of Istanbul PPP Center of Excellence. Welcome to our PPP talks. I can see now we are reaching to 100 participants, so we have more than registration. And we are starting our 5th PPP talks. Today, we will discuss the results of a global PPP survey conducted by David, my close friend, among the PPP experts from 70 countries. I am sure it will give us some tips about the way forward for our PPP sector and the climate, PPP climate, entire the world. As we know, we are going through uncertain times in terms of infrastructure investment sector as well. We can see some improvements after 6 months of silence. The most important thing is that we cannot see the future clearly and we cannot predict. But there are two main issues now today. One is what is the influence of pandemic, a PPP during the past 6 months in different projects and in different countries. And the future of infrastructure sector, what will happen and what we will expect from this progress. And we saw the future scenarios in GI Hub report, which is published last month. And I like it very much. There are some scenarios for the future of infrastructure. The first one is digital planet. We are going through a more digital planet. And the second scenario is focused on more conflicted planet, what will happen. And the third one is more green planet. I think all these three scenarios will affect the future of infrastructure facilities and infrastructure investment in the world. And we will see what will happen. Actually, all these effects of these scenarios. So how we will bundle, how we will combine all these scenarios together for the infrastructure investment sector. During these uncertain times, we see that many countries continue to actively promote some PPP projects from Kazakhstan to Oman, Belarus, and some of comes from African countries also. I know some PPP projects in Nigeria, in Uganda, but some of them are trying to solve some really rigid problems of their PPP projects and what happened, what was the real influence, real effects of pandemic on these projects. So due to all of this, David's survey, I think it started on March or April. I think he will give some more and clear information to us. And this survey is very important and it will demonstrate the problems encountered in PPP on a global level and helps to predict the future of PPP projects in different countries. So now I will give the floor to David and there will be a chance for you to write your question on the chat box and I will try to moderate the questions, and at the end of David's presentation, I will forward your questions and we will have a discussion session. So David, the floor is yours.
Good morning from my side, good afternoon for some, and I'm sure it's good evening for others because of the wide attendance of this. I'm going to start sharing the screen so we can see the presentation. So, well, welcome. My name is David Baxter. I'm a longtime colleague of Dr. Aydın. We have collaborated for many years. I think this is our 5th year now in the annual PPP Centers PPP Week in Istanbul. And I work as an independent consultant, but I'm also affiliated with the International Sustainable Resilience Center, which is associated with the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe's PPP Center of Excellence in Geneva. And then Dr. Aydın and I also collaborate extensively where we work as steering committee members for the World Association of Public-Private Partnership Units and PPPs. So this survey was sent to people on my, let's call it my LinkedIn Rolodex or my LinkedIn connections. And we got a response of 164 practitioners from 7 countries. And I asked them to share their insights on the status of PPPs in the pandemic era. I'll talk a little bit about the survey launch, the responding countries, survey questions, results or feedback by question, have some closing comments, and I've also provided some additional readings. And I believe that this presentation will be made available for those who want to, for those who might want to refer to it back. So in March, well, in April, May, I started having a lot of conversations with practitioners around the world as the world started shutting down and we couldn't travel. I was at one of the last conferences on PPPs that was held in Dubai, and both Dr. Ayub and I and a few others, I think when we returned home to our home countries, we had no clue that we might be in the last wave of people traveling or basically attending conferences. They were, in the survey I sent it out to approximately 1,000 LinkedIn contacts. And by the time I finalized the survey, I had received about 164 responses from 70 countries. But what was interesting is I still continue to receive, even yesterday, I received comments, as obviously not everyone always looks at their LinkedIn accounts. The study or the survey was not meant to be statistically verifiable. So what you're seeing and what you're hearing is just feedback from people, in that sense, practitioners of PPPs mainly, from both the public and the private sector, where I had a conversation with them through LinkedIn on answering a set of questions and just trying to find out what their experiences are, what they were grappling with, what their challenges they were facing as we entered this pandemic period. And then also you'll see, I also wanted to find out what their forward-looking feelings were as well. You can see the distribution, quite a lot from Europe, a fair amount from Africa, from Latin America, North America, and then even in Asia. So I feel that it does cover globally at least many of the questions and challenges and thoughts that people are having. The World Bank did a similar study, but they focused basically working with public sector institutions around the world, and that is good because the public sector insight is important. But I decided to ask both public sector and private sector participants and practitioners these questions because I felt that it was important when you talk about PPPs, public-private partnerships, that both parties should be consulted. You can see the list of the countries of respondents. You don't have to read them all, but you can see Europe was a very large response. Asia was quite large, Middle East. Africa was also fairly well represented. And you can see the percentages below there, with Africa being 20%, approximately, Asia 19%, Australia, a very small percentage, but it's a smaller market. Europe 27%, the Middle East 13%, North America 8%, and South America 7.6%. It's not surprising that I would say that North America and South America were underrepresented because the PPP market is still developing and evolving there versus other markets where it's much more established. So the questions that were asked of the respondents, and I sent this to them in LinkedIn messages, was what were the two biggest challenges that you could face in regards to the COVID-19 impacts? What two PPP sectors did you see as being the most vulnerable? What two PPP sectors do you see as being the most promising in a post-COVID era? What help would you appreciate, as a practitioner or as a government, from development banks, donors, investors, and developers as you move forward with your PPP programs? And what positive opportunities do you see the COVID pandemic crisis creating for a new approach to paradigms and PPPs? Because I think there is a realization, and you'll see this as we go through the feedback, that we might not be able to do PPPs as we've done them in the past. And so governments and practitioners, public and private sector representatives are actively going to be thinking of, can we do them better? Can we do them differently? And what was really important and a good finding was that I didn't come across anyone who said COVID had killed PPPs. If anything, COVID has now given a greater impetus to doing PPPs even better. So the concerns, and this might not be a surprise to you, but there were concerns about shrinking investor interest, especially in future projects. And this is due to the weakening financial global market. There were also concerns about current projects that were underway being able to generate revenues and the ability of governments to make availability payments and meet deferred concession payments. And this is understanding, you can imagine, and I'm sure you've seen this or heard about it, massive airport PPPs where there are no people attending no one's going through the airports anymore. And this has placed considerable pressure on concessionaires and operators who are not getting revenues. And obviously, in many cases, they have been reaching out to governments and saying, we need availability payments if these were negotiated in contracts. But in actual fact, in many instances now, governments are under pressure because they're not getting the tax revenues and they might not be able to meet those commitments as well. Project risk management and mitigation was also another big challenge. And this was specifically in operating airports and in construction of new airports or larger infrastructure facilities like hospitals, etc., where people were brought into close proximity to one another because there was a fear, that people would face the situation that they couldn't go to these sites or they would get, COVID if they went there. I think also, the focus has switched slightly, that there's a strong focus now on the short-term crisis management of projects. And this will change now as people refocus on the long-term PPP programs that they have been initiating as countries do this. However, I think what's also going to happen is you're going to find that there's going to be a reconsideration of projects in pipelines. Technical advisors, being unable to reach projects. This is typically even the situation of me where I haven't been able to travel for 5 months now, and I have projects waiting that I'm supposed to be working on, but I can't get to them. The force majeure provisions was also very, very heavily emphasized by almost every respondent to the survey, and this especially, that force majeure, which is an act of nature which people can't predict. What were the implications for this? And then the other one was adjusting project contract deliverable expectations. Can we even expect, the private sector to deliver? Can the public sector support it? These type of questions that I'm sure you're all facing. There were other concerns, staff availability, long-term concerns versus short-term concerns, accountability to stakeholders, and then also the declining project site monitoring, which was of great concern because you have projects where people can't get to. And if they can't get to it, they can't monitor it, and you don't know if the construction's taking place well, or if the project has gone dormant, if there's going to be any damage to the project. Not surprising, it's the impact on the balance sheets of investors, concerns about project liquidity. The other, which is going to be an area of great interest and see how this works out, is also inflexible legislation and frameworks, legal frameworks that don't seem to be able to proactively address impacts to PPP projects right now, because the laws and the frameworks are kind of static and stuck, and these will have to be revisited. In many countries also, what has happened is that the public sector bureaucracy has not helped, because when the private sector concessionaires and operators have tried to be proactive, they get bureaucratic red tape and challenges put across them, and it makes it difficult for them to try and fix the problems that they're facing. The other is intervention by politicians who are making all sorts of promises, demanding all sorts of things, especially of the danger of those who don't really understand what a PPP is and the complexity of them. The impacts to supply chain logistics, I think you'd understand. And then this one is really important, the long-term perceptions of what it means for PPPs in the pandemic or times of pandemic austerity or post-pandemic times. So here are the most vulnerable sectors. This was question 2 that was asked. Which sectors were the most vulnerable? I don't think you'd be surprised. Transportation was the biggest and the most vulnerable. You can just think of toll roads, airports, ports, not operating because there are no users. I live just outside Washington, D.C., and if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., you'll know that traffic is terrible, and to travel from my house to downtown DC on a good day using the toll road would maybe take you an hour. Now with almost no usage, I can get from my house to downtown Washington, DC in 10 minutes. And that is just because there is no one there. No one's using it. It's no rush hour. You can imagine the impact that that's had on the tolls that are being collected. Tourism, this is I'm surprised this wasn't larger, but there were many countries obviously who responded who don't have an active tourism sector. But for Turkey, you would know it's disastrous, for Greece, for Italy, for Spain, even here in Washington, DC, which is one of the most visited cities in North America, tourism has just died. Power and energy, there you might ask why power and energy is basically because people aren't employed and can't pay for their services. Healthcare is an interesting one, and that was because mainly the reason that was given for that was that people, or let's say the pandemic has revealed the shortcomings of healthcare, and it is placing pressure on hospital PPPs. I won't read them all, but education is also a challenge, as you can see, especially as we move towards the sort of distance learning or online learning that's taking place, and the setups and that aren't available to do this. I just want to show that obviously the world isn't homogeneous and there are different regions. I looked at not just the general, but which continents or regions had different impacts. Similar, but in some cases there are different ones as well. So you could see, you know, tourism was important. Australia, tourism wasn't really mentioned. And then you can just see it's the region that you come from. But in the transportation sector, the most commonly mentioned type of vulnerable projects were toll roads, as I mentioned, rail projects, airports, and shipping ports. And then in respondents from Turkey, the biggest areas of concern or the sectors were the highways, airports, and tourism. And I don't think that's a surprise to anyone if you think of Istanbul with the Bosphorus Tunnel, the Bosphorus bridges, the massive new airport that has been built, and then tourism PPPs, which would also be impacted. Additional comments were made about the sectors most at risk. And there was a concern that, you know, are large-scale projects, mega projects as they're often referred to, even possible? Will they have to be postponed? And will there be a focus on smaller projects in the foreseeable future? There was also concern about the decline in users, user payments, trade, changes in commuter behavior. And that's going to be a big one, the changes in commuter behavior, because it's going to take a while before people feel comfortable about riding public transport. And this has definitely been seen, for example, in the Washington, DC metro, where ridership has dropped dramatically. And that would have challenges based on the operator of the metro because they're not going to have revenue. There's healthcare projects have faced considerable strain due to the massive increase in users and limited or finite resources. This is more specific, I think, to places in Africa where the healthcare system is challenged even before the COVID-19 pandemic. Your payment guarantees were also concerned. Then, you know, unemployed users being unable to pay for services provided. And then existing PPP legislation, I think this is a real important focus area that has not considered severe pandemic events. I was interesting just before this morning, I was worried if I was going to be able to make this presentation. We had a massive power failure, and when my wife and I called the power company to find out why all the power in the whole area had gone out, the first message that we got was, and this was interesting, that we understand that you cannot pay your power bill. We will not cut off power to you, but please pay as soon as you can. That was the general message, which is nice that you don't get your power cut off because you can't, but obviously that would place energy or power providers who are operating on a PPP scheme under considerable pressure because they can't run without revenue. So when it came to the sectors that are most promising, this was question 3, it was interesting that some of those that were most under threat in the previous question were also shown as those having the most promising opportunities. And I was a little confounded by that until I read further and I saw why or what the reason for this was. And basically healthcare, it is most promising because a lot has to be done. Digital infrastructure is really very, very important now. And I think people have realized that we're living more and more in a digital world, not by choice, but by force. Power and energy, transportation is also important, education. So the sectors that were identified as most challenged were also identified, ironically, as the sectors offering the most promise. And I think that's because of their prominence in PPPs, but also, as you'll see here, some of the reasons. Just again, a breakdown by the region. You can see in Africa, it was quite difficult different to the Middle East. What was interesting, and this popped up in some places, is the whole idea of smart transportation. And I think this is one of the reasons that people have realized now that smart transportation is going to be the future, and we'll see how that pans out. In Turkey, you could also see short-term healthcare and medical equipment in the long run. Renewable energy and telecommunications were seen as the most positive by Turkish respondents. There were observations that I made, is that, healthcare, though that's the most vulnerable, is also considered the most promising. It was also, basically driven by the fact that the healthcare sector was unprepared for the magnitude of the pandemic. In transportation, this was really important, that green, renewable, and smart technology sectors have shown great promise, or will show great promise, especially when it's tied to things like transportation. I found it interesting that tourism dropped off the area of positive sectors, but where people did still mention tourism as a great opportunity for PPPs, that it was driven by the fact that these needed to be green type of tourism, environmental tourism, that was more flexible and sustainable. So on the question 4, questions were asked of the respondents. If you could ask somebody for help, what would you look for? And I'm just going to go through the headings because I don't want to dominate the whole time. But things that were talked about was additional technical support. And this was to the public and the private sector so that better projects could be defined. The fast tracking of capacity building. So, finding ways to improve the delivery and the procurement and the delivery of projects. Obviously, the next one, supplementing financial support was not a surprise. And this is going on all the time. I just read in the Bloomberg yesterday, there was a very interesting article about what's happening with airports and how they're restructuring, refocusing. Singapore Airport, for example, is now allowing citizens of the city of Singapore or the state of Singapore to go to Changi Airport and actually have a day there. They don't have to fly, but they can go in and do shopping at the duty-free shops and use all the wonderful facilities at the airport. Maybe they'll consider that at your new airport in Istanbul. But what they're also doing is this is an attempt to find alternative sources of revenue and also, making a case for future financial support. This one, the bullet at the top, is critically important, that shareholders, and this is the public and the private sector and all involved parties, are going to have to talk more than they have ever in the past. And they're really going to have to examine the whole idea of what a partnership means. And this is important because I'm of the fundamental belief that failure of PPP projects is not an option. And it's critically important that that the public and the private sector enhance their collaboration, not beat one another up now when things go wrong. Improving communication, that's understandable. De-risking, a lot of companies and organizations say they need new de-risking tools so that future projects will not be as vulnerable. The other, obviously, is how we're going to address force majeure events, and they need guarantee packages. This is going to be interesting to see how this happens. But the major event that's going to happen is there will be an impact from insurance. And if insurance companies refuse to insure projects, or the force majeure events are unclear, that is going to place additional pressure on proponents of PPPs, and they are going to have to find ways to ensure that force majeure is not just a sort of a non-committal, vague approach, but becomes critically important. The other obviously is, now big holes in PPP project contracts are being identified, which need to be addressed. There's a greater need, for PPP advocacy or support. One thing is that many respondents also pointed out that there's going to have to be help and discussion between the public-private sector through market outreach, for example, on what PPP programs are really viable, and with the existing pipelines, whether they should be restructured. And I think the public sector is going to need a lot of help and collaboration from the private sector in this regard. The other that's, is obvious now is that the PPP legislation or legal frameworks has holes in it that have to be addressed. And so everyone is saying is, where do we find this support to revisit our PPP reforms? Then also improving the procurement processes and best management. One area when many projects fall flat is through a bad procurement. If you've been following the news in North America, there's a situation here where we have a big project just outside of Washington, D.C. called the Purple Line Light Rail Project. And it seems that the procurement might have been slightly less than desirous because there was a focus on a cheaper project instead of a technically strong project. And this is a challenge. Most times, procurement officials are told, we want the best deal, but the best deal might not involve the best technologically adapted, sustainable, resilient project. And then also, embracing innovation incentives. That, the positive attitudes that we are asked, what do you think will come out of the post-pandemic period? They think that there's opportunities that will lead to improved PPP contracts, better ones, new legal reforms that will embrace sustainability and sustainability when it comes to PPP policies, streamlining the procurement process and the implementation, and this is important, the implementation of future PPP projects. And maybe this can also be retrofitted to existing projects, but that would take considerable negotiation. The other is that, and Dr. Ayup and I have been involved with this as well, that the social contracts between governments and citizens is changing, and this has become increasingly important under the pandemic. And there now needs to be a focus on what is being referred to as a new paradigm of people first PPPs. So this is not just the PPPs as we used to do them, where we focused on value for money. There's also now needs to be a focus on value for people and value for the future. And I think value for future is critically important, because as we face the situation where PPP contracts can be 20, 25, 30 years in duration and even longer, we need to have projects that are future-proofed and which are sustainable and which are resilient to the unknown. This time last year, no one had a clue what is happening in this world was ever going to happen. I don't think we even could have imagined it. But I think one good outcome of this is that people are going to be more aware of the changing world and how things can change so dramatically. There's also going to be, pioneering paradigm shifts in the way governments will do PPPs, redefining priorities, highlighting increasing importance of new generations of smart projects, especially in healthcare, education, and the IT sectors. Maybe also smaller projects now are going to be of more interest, as many respondents said, because the large mega projects are even riskier than the small ones. I think also that's interesting is, the geopolitical leveling of the playing field between the North and South. And emerging economies, I think, are in a really good position as they pursue PPPs in the post-COVID-19 pandemic era, is that the sense that they can look at all the mistakes that emerged economies made and avoid them. And then there's also, you know, demands for greater collaboration. Allocation of project risk, that's also, you know, I think we'll have to really investigate that. And, you know, also MEGA, for example, might have to take a redefined approach. Financial reforms will definitely have to occur. There should also be, sorry, that's repeated for some reason, the improved dialogue, as I mentioned. Now is the time for parties to sit down and talk. And a number of respondents had indicated on large projects that they were working with that pandemic steering committees had been set up, which they meet regularly and they find ways to make the project survive instead of finding ways to beat one another up and saying you're not meeting deliverables or expectations. And I think the other one, and there's going to be a lot of studies on that, is adopting lessons learned. Anyone who ignores lessons learned, I think will be missing a wonderful opportunity. And then encouraging, you know, which is also important for landlocked countries, more and more transnational PPPs, you know, transportation corridors, especially in Africa, which has the most landlocked countries in the world. This is going to be critical. Just some closing comments. You know, although one would expect that many would have felt that PPPs were done, I don't think this was the case of representatives from the 70 countries who represented PPP units in private and the private sector. There was an enthusiasm for doing PPPs just better. And that there's, you know, there's a response that the way of doing PPPs has changed. And there's a paradigm shift. Practitioners also pointed out it's time for refocusing on more relevant projects and projects which are defensible, sustainable, and resilient. And this really ties into the whole idea of the projects that you're doing. For example, will they help your country's sustainable development goals, its priorities, etc.? Unfortunately, in many countries, as I'm sure you're aware, there are many projects that have been done as PPPs, as prestige projects. If your economy is fine, that's great. You know, you can have your big sports stadiums as PPPs, you can have big fancy museums as PPPs, but as money is tighter now and challenges are bigger, you know, focused on post-pandemic recovery, you know, maybe these projects will be pushed back a bit now and people will focus on hospitals, healthcare, smart transportation, technology, etc. And then, as I said, also that PPPs are going to play an increasingly important role. We will have a chance for questions, but I just wanted to say, and you'll get this, if you want to ever contact me or ask any questions about the survey, I can be reached, and I think you'll get this contact information. And then if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, I write blogs basically every week. These are two of the latest ones. You can see one on August the 10th, where I talked about disasters and is the resilience dialogue bankrupt? You might find some interesting sites there. And then for our African colleagues who are here, is how do we do PPPs with better integrity and how do we implement them further? And then just as a teaser here, and I'm sure Dr. April mentioned it, but we are facing the situation also where the conference that we hold annually was basically held in Istanbul. This year it's going to be virtual, but this is an opportunity for you to register and join some of the sessions which will be held between the 2nd and 5th of November. So I hand back over to Dr. Ayub.
Yes, David, thank you very much for your presentation. Actually, we have some questions. Someone from Pakistan asking if you got some results from Pakistan. So they would like to give some insights.
Oh gosh, I can't remember exactly because I haven't got the countries up, but I believe, yes, I did get some results from Pakistan, yes.
And also we have a question from Pakistan again. Mr. Ömer Faruk asked you about some political force majeure events. You know, pandemics are not categorized as non-political, or categorized as non-political force majeure events. So he is asking about how the governments and the private party will allocate risk, better allocation, make a better allocation for risk management after the pandemic.
Okay, so I think, you know, the political perception of force majeure is a challenging one. I did a survey of the World Bank's force majeure clauses that they have included in examples of documents. And when you look at force majeure, there's political, obviously, is very high up there. And basically the challenge there, if it's an internationally funded project, if there's international financiers involved, there has to be some sort of force majeure political insurance provided. For very large projects, that's usually done through MIGA, which is the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Association. It's associated with the World Bank, and they focus specifically on force majeure when it comes to political events. But I think what needs to happen in countries is that we need to educate politicians internally for projects, especially if they are financed domestically, because politicians need to understand that PPP projects are long-term projects, and these projects most likely in countries where elections take place regularly, most likely will live or exist longer than their political tenure as a politician. And so if they can't afford, if they can't support the project because of the value of the project, and they rather decide to support a project politically because it makes them look good, the politicians, I think we are going to face challenges. I would say to politicians, even if you're not going to be around in 20 years' time or 30 years' time when the project gets to closure, it can still be a legacy for politicians. So, there are ways to manage political interference or risk with projects. The biggest challenge, I think, though, is those when it comes to international conflicts on transnational boundary projects. For example, like in, along the Nile River, where there are projects, or in West Africa with ECOWAS. If an argument or a disagreement breaks out between different countries, that's a whole new magnitude level, which could impact the viability of a transnational project.
Yes, we have another question, David, not about the results of the survey, but George Farley asking, when we refer to the healthcare for PPP projects, we are referring to service delivery or the facilities. So as these are fundamentally different providers, he's asking about the healthcare PPP. Maybe do you want some clarification, or I can give some example from Turkish experience as well?
I'll just add a very, very short comment, and then Eyüp, I think it would be better if you answered that one specifically. But obviously it's correct, as was pointed out, PPPs in healthcare can be two types, the service type or the facility type. I think that, what's going to happen with the what you call it, the funding shortages and budgets in countries, that there might be a situation, and I'm just, that's a feeling I have, that governments might build less hospitals for the next few years, which is counterintuitive to what is needed, because they won't have the resources and they're going to have to reach out to the private sector as partners. And I think the two options there, if they're going to build new hospitals, that's fine. If they're going to maybe retrofit hospitals as brownfield projects and improve them, that's another option. But it's not always just so much the hospital, but it's the service agreement as well, because you can have the most fantastic, beautiful hospital, but if no one is running it, servicing it, then you have a situation of, that the hospital really serves no purpose. So, I think it depends country by country basis. I think in Europe, there would be more of a focus on the service type PPP contracts, maybe even in Canada, where hospitals are really built up. In Africa, it's more likely to be building new hospitals. But I know, Eyüp, you've been very involved with a lot of projects with the healthcare in Turkey, and I think this would be a good opportunity for you to comment on that.
Thank you, David. Actually, PPP is bundling the different services. So yes, one part is the infrastructure facilities development, which is we are basing on availability payment, and the private party gets their revenue from the availability payments of the infrastructure facilities, and the other types of revenue is coming from the service delivery. Sure, the deliverers, providers are different, but actually we are bundling the tenders, and we are telling them the sponsors, and sponsors get the tenders, won the win, and they established two SPV, special purpose vehicle, which the first one is responsible for the facilities development, and the second one will be responsible from the service delivery. It's a very long story, but the providers are totally different in PPP healthcare campuses, also in Turkey. And David, we have a question from Iran. And actually, Reza is asking about, can you please give more explanation about People First PPP, what it means? I think some of our participants doesn't know, some of, as we know, knows about People First PPP. What is People First PPP, and what UNEC is doing regarding People First PPP's topics?
Thank you for asking that. So I've been involved for a number of years, and AYUP is also involved, in an initiative where we are exploring the new approach to public-private partnerships. UNECE, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe's PPP Center of Excellence, which is located in Geneva, launched this initiative about 4 years ago to look at ways on how PPPs can be implemented in a manner that help countries address their sustainable development goals better. And in that sense, what was the focus was, how do we improve sustainability? How do we improve resilience? And then also focus on what are the reasons we do projects? Are we doing them because we can? Are we doing them because we need to? Are we doing them because we understand what people's needs are? And increasingly, there's, a need in the world as it's changing that we listen to the users of PPP projects. You don't want to impose a project. Many countries have built toll roads and then no one uses them. The reasons could be because people can't afford them. In South Africa, where I originally come from, when they built the major Gauteng, this is the region up in the northern part of the country, toll road between Pretoria and Johannesburg, there were riots and people went crazy when the toll roads were put in place. And it seemed that people weren't consulted. A similar thing also happened in Albania. I think it was the beginning of last year when the new toll road connection to Kosovo was built. There was a lot of people who were very upset and protested against the toll fees. So when you look at people first, it's that whole idea that typically when we examine bankability of projects, one of the big assessments that we do is value for money. And value for money is not just the value you're getting for the money spent, but it's always had undertones or undercurrents of, other concerns like people, environment, etc. So what we are calling for with the People First PPPs is, to accentuate the sense of people as well, so value for people, and then value for the future. So that's just expanding the concept of value for money. It doesn't replace it. It's just adding extra filters of reviews when you decide whether you're going to do projects. And the concerns can be everything from, as I said, sustainability, resilience, climate change. If you're building a project that's going to hydroelectric project, and then there's going to be no water because of climate change to power the turbines, why are you building it? And then, it's just the sense also of, people are important. And so if you go to UNEC's, which you call website, if you did a Google search and you did UNECE People First or PFPPP, there you will see what this is about. There's a concept law that countries can consider, which is available. There are the principles of People First PPPs that are there. And which is really exciting is that we are currently developing a tool to do assessments on projects, which will help determine whether they do adjust and accept the concepts and the principles, etc., of PPP first. And I think this, or People First, sorry, PPPs. And I think this is also going to become critically important more as development banks, international institutions, and that consider what type of projects they're going to finance or fund, depending what organization it is, that, you know, this focus on people, environmental stability, sustainability, all those abilities, you know, that you can add onto a project are going to play a greater role.
Yes, David, thank you. We have lots of questions regarding people first PPP. I'll come back again, but there's a very good question from Robert. And I would like to ask you, maybe, would you give some insights about small PPP projects? He's commenting on, yes, it's very difficult to fund via commercial banks to small PPP project. It's not, you know, easy to handling small projects with commercial banks or maybe MDBs. So how public sector will handle all this, you know, mass problem? What do you think? Because I think in the future scenario, we will see more small PPP projects, not mega projects. So, you know, $100 million project. We will see more flexible, more green, more or smaller PPP project. What do you think about that question?
Now that's a valid question, because I think one of the biggest questions that's always asked is, what is the ideal size of a PPP project, and what is, you know, the investment, you know, level, the desired investment level? I've worked in a number of countries, you know, and what could be a small project in one country can be an enormous project in another country. So I'll just take, for example, some of the projects that are taking place in New York with the improvements of the metro there. There was a report of 1 mile, just 1 mile, and what's that, 1.6 kilometers of metro construction that took place, and it cost $2 to $3 billion. And I can't even, you know, I can't remember the exact amount, but you can imagine to a country like South Africa or a country like Lesotho, you know, $3 to $4 billion is an enormous amount of money. And, you know, it's true that investors will look at projects. One of the biggest challenges that I've seen in emerging economies is they try and launch PPP projects for $1 million, $2 million, $3 million. Those aren't going to work because the transactional costs are just too high. You know, you'd destroy the project just preparing it even before you've actually launched it. So what is important in that case is that I think you need to consider bundling smaller projects to make them more attractive to investors and banks. The other question obviously is also based on the fact of, you know, which market are you in and which currency are you going to do? Yeah, so an African country, if it relies on domestic banks and domestic investors, obviously their reach is less, and so they would prefer smaller projects. And here I'm talking about projects that are 20, 30, 40, $50 million, not $1 million or $2 million projects. But it is true that in the United States, I could see very few banks even being interested in a project that's 10 million. I'm currently working on a project, helping develop a project in Mexico. And I reached out to some investors, and I did find that there are green, sustainable, resilient investment funds that are actually looking for projects that are in the range of 50 to like $150 million. So small, not a mega project. But, you know, for us, a country like Sri Lanka, where I've worked, $50 to $150 million is a mega project for them. So I agree, you know, small projects won't work in certain places, big projects will work in others. It depends on the scale, the size of the project, the interest shown. And I think this is also important that governments who are going to launch these projects really understand the appetite of investors for their projects. And this means, you know, market sounding, reaching out to investors. I've worked in some countries where they've gone through an extensive process of, you know, setting up PPP projects, trying to procure them, and no one even bid. And, you know, the question I've always asked is, did you even reach out to the private sector? So a bit of a rambling answer, but I hope that helps.
Thank you, David. There is another question, which I like very much. So, you know, after the COVID-19, we are discussing among PPP experts. One side is the fan of PPP. They are telling PPP will not be an option, maybe will be a mandatory to provide public services for the public authorities. And the other side, the national budget is very constrained and in a very bad position. So the government cannot be able to develop more PPP after COVID-19. So Dr. Irfan from Dubai is asking about, do we have any best practice or good practice how the national budget will be allowed to more PPP projects? And actually, the concrete question, the valid question is that, so how we can handle risk management for PPP project for the government, and how we will develop more PPP projects. And the second question is, it means that when we are talking about some PPP project, we are talking about foreign direct investment and international investment to developing and emerging markets. So how we will use PPP as a tool to attracting FDIs to our infrastructure facilities. So I will give the floor to you, but I invited Dr. Irfan here. Are you here, doctor? Okay, maybe you will start to answer this question.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, because the reality is, with declining tax revenue, commercial activity, and that governments are going to find that their national budgets have shrunk. And I don't see this as a disaster. I actually see this as an opportunity for the public sector or governments to open more to FDI, because the reality is that they are going to need foreign investors, but they could also use domestic investors. Many countries underutilize domestic investors. One area that's becoming increasingly of interest, and I've seen this in a number of discussions, is also diaspora communities that are considering investing in countries that they came from. But what is important is you have to make the case that, if an investor is going to be treated well, are they, is the risk going to be in such a way that the project is bankable? Governments are going to have to get realistic. You're going to have to allocate risk. You've got to look at the investment levels and make sure the project is bankable. You're going to have to reach out to investors and talk to them and ask them, what are they looking for? This might be difficult for governments because they've always felt maybe that they're in control, but now maybe they're less in control, and they're going to have to, reconsider what a partnership means and have true partnerships. And I think this is, a way that there's going to be a coming together of the public and private sector on projects that are going to be under this fine microscope of, are they really sustainable and are they resilient? Governments are going to have to prove that their projects are sustainable and resilient, that they're not, white elephant projects or prestige projects. The reality is also that I once spoke to a person, a very wise gentleman from Africa, and I wish I could remember his name, and he said to me, investors are not sentimental. And I thought that was brilliant. He said, investors will go to countries that make a good case. And this is really important, that countries are going to have to make a good case. And just take a situation, and I'll maybe use, because I know Dr. Irfan is a good friend of mine as well, and he comes from the GCC region, that countries in that region are competing with investors to attract, investment for FDI. And basically, I think the bottom line is the country that makes the best case, that offers the best assurances that the risk will be allocated properly, and that understands the need for a true partnership between the public and private sector, and that investors are not there to gouge the governments, but are there to help. I once heard an interesting government official say, and this was very interesting, that PPPs are of concern to them because PPPs can be seen as nationalization of debt and privatization of profit. And I think if a government has the sense that they always think that the private sector is going to rip them off and that they're going to be sitting and facing all the financial problems, then there's going to be a challenge. And this is real in the sense of badly designed projects or projects which have a naive sort of intention behind them. And then the other thing that I would just say, which is a little tangential, but important for this, is that, maybe this opens up the opportunity for more very well structured, unsolicited proposals, where there are developers and investors who have really good ideas, who come to governments and, can prove that this project is going to be good and are willing to let it eventually become a competitive and transparent procurement. But, open up the doors to that. So if governments are at a loss, they don't have ideas how they can attract investors in that, reach out and see, or just make it aware that if you come to us with a really good project that is bankable and it serves a need that we hadn't even considered, or it provides a solution to the funding gap that we are facing, maybe we'll consider it.
David, Patricia from Peru also is stressing on that topic. Last year, according to World Bank report, entire the world, more than 60% of all PPP was based on governmental guarantees. So it's based on availability payment, not the user fee PPP project. It means that still we are developing PPP project based on governmental guarantees and public payment. So now Patricia also is stressing that one, how, what's your opinion, how the government will develop these kind of projects and taking consideration of COVID-19, for example, in the transport sector. So what will happen, how they will develop this kind of, because most of these transport PPP projects based on user fee, and so do you think, is there any chance to develop another risk mitigation mechanism for this kind of PPP projects?
So I would say that one of the most important things that needs to be done is that governments are going to have to reevaluate all the projects they have in their pipeline. It makes no use pushing projects forward now that might not be successful. So if they were based on availability payments, if they have 10 and they know they can only fund through availability payments 5 of them, they might need to prioritize and drop those projects that aren't viable anymore. It'll be tough for governments to do this, but I think there has to be a very, very clear understanding of those guarantees under those commitments, and this ties extensively into force majeure. I've seen numerous debates and conversations taking place where governments are saying, well, we just can't afford to step in and make availability payments because, even though the contract states that this was going to happen, we don't have the money. And the challenge there is, are the terms going to be renegotiated? Is there going to be some sort of, negotiated debt holiday, if you can call it that? Could you extend the project a little longer, so that the debt payment can be longer? I don't know the exact answer, but what is going to be critically important is we can't ignore it. Yeah. And it's going to be really important to prioritize those projects. And, there's going to be a contraction, I think, in many PPP projects being put forward that rely on government assistance. But again, it's going to be, what are our priorities? Which ones do we really need? And which ones can we do without for the time being?
Okay, I think Dr. Irfan is with us.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ayub, for giving me this opportunity, and I'd like to congrats my friend, Mr. Baxter, for his interesting and insightful presentation. Well, I think that the question that has to be asked nowadays, especially from developing countries' perspective, is there should be sort of mixed policies, if you like, in order to encourage the government to go ahead in their ambitious PP projects. The first one is macroeconomic stimulus and maybe riskier policies, that ensure a minimum economic and monetary stability. Namely, this is the prerequisite, if you like, that should be available in order to attract the domestic and also international investors to come in and engage in PPP contracts. But secondly, as David Baxter, I think, already mentioned in his fantastic presentation, there should be also sort of robust, if you like, PPP-friendly environment that encourage the FDIs to come. But I think the question here, Mr. Baxter, especially again for low-income countries, if you like, or poor natural resources income countries, as in many continents, I'm sure. how can the governments attract FDIs given in such a very unprecedented, I don't like to say financial crunch, but let me say budget tough policies in many of these countries, while, as you surely know, PPP usually entails a huge amount of money, especially if we are talking about larger scale and long-term PP projects, which absolutely entails a lot of money, which is not available in their humble public fund. So how can, what do you think? Can you draw some lessons from the best practices, Mr. Baxter, given your wealth of knowledge and experiences globally? How can those kind of governments can attract FDIs to come in and fuel, especially for privately financed PPP schemes? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I had an interesting experience in Kenya a few years ago when I was talking to some officials at the National PPP unit. And I asked them, you know, they were talking about launching projects and trying to find investors, et cetera, and that. And I asked them, you know, what is the biggest challenge that you faced, you know, with attracting investors? And it wasn't even just foreign direct investment, but it was also domestic investment. And they said to me one thing is that in Kenya at that stage, most banks didn't even know what a PPP was. And that left me totally, you know, totally confounded because, you know, how do you launch an investment program where you're requiring, you know, PPPs and trying to get investors who are going to find loans to cover their debts if they don't even understand what a PPP is. But what's also important is in many cases that many government officials, and I mean this with all respect, don't really understand what a PPP is. So there has to be an increased education on what it means. One of the challenges that I've also heard, which needs to be addressed, is that you know, when PPPs are launched, they're a bit like a mortgage that you take out on your home, that you can find, you know, new mortgage companies taking over the mortgage, and then, you know, you never quite know who you own the money to. That's one of the things that I think is also important, is making pretty clear whether refinancing of the project is going to be acceptable and under what terms. Because you might have investors, you know, have an appetite for investing in a large project for maybe 5 or 6 years. But, you know, if the project's going to be a 30-year project and 20 years of it is going to require debt payment and, you know, repaying investors on that, there could be concern that this is too long. And I know banks find it hard to, you know, invest money for a very, very long time. You know, 5 years is, you know, pushing it for some. So I think what is important is also, you know, looking at the reinvestment opportunities, the rules for that, making clear whether it's possible. It's also important that governments do control the reinvestment, because you don't want to swap a good bank for a bad bank or a good investor for a bad investor. And you also don't want massive profit taking that takes place. So, you know, those are some of the challenges. But again, I think, you know, overall, the overarching thing that needs to take place to attract investment is that they have to be very, very well done financial studies and feasibility studies so that you can make the case. And you know what's going to happen is, and in many cases, investors and financial institutions who have the access to, you know, bring in financial direct or FDI investment into a country are going to examine in great detail your plan, your idea. They might actually have better people who are going to evaluate your plan than you do. And so where you make a determination of bankability, they might just say, this project, there's no way it's bankable and we can't invest. So, you know, I think one thing that governments are going to have to do is, you know, find very competent advisors at times who can, you know, make the case, you know, look at the financial models, look at the predictions, etc. And this costs money, unfortunately, but there are ways, you know, in the feasibility studies to recoup the cost later on. Again, I was going to give an example which happened here in Virginia, in the DC area, the Purple Line project that I mentioned. You know, it's a $5.6 billion project to build a light rail loop, and it's under considerable pressure now, and it might fail, and the consortium that's doing the construction is threatening to pull out, which means that the project company, or the special purpose vehicle that's being established, which includes organizations like Meridian and all of that, which have invested in the project, will face tremendous losses. And this is important, that the countries need to make sure that they don't have a record of failed projects, because when you have a record of failed projects, you're going to have a greater perception of risk, and that's just going to mean that investors are going to run away. So I don't know if that helps.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Dr. Irfan, for your comments. David, I would like to bundle some questions regarding SDGs and People First PPP. And Hülya from IMC, I think she's in London now. She is asking about, do you have any solid example, this kind of People First PPP projects in Asia, in Latin America, in the medium or long term? So how those countries will reshape infra need policies based on People First PPP? Because there are many questions. They would like to see some solid example. So what it means, People First PPP? Is there any example? So how the governments will drive in People First PPP? And another questions also regarding People First PPP, which sector are the most suitable one to implement People First PPP?
Okay, so concerning the first question, UNECE over the last 2-3 years has built up what you call a compendium, or what you call a case study book, if you want to call that, of successful or PPP type projects that considered or included elements of People First projects. And I think at the last count that I heard that there was a few hundred cases that they've got. So again, if you go to the UNECE website, there is a document you can download which lists projects from countries all over the world, Africa, the Middle East, even I believe Latin America, etc., which lists projects where experts did an evaluation on whether they address the People First concept. So I think that, you know, is a very valuable source. Currently, at the moment, as the tool is being developed for determining whether projects are really People First projects, this tool in future will be able to be applied to projects, and for countries that are determining how they, or countries which are considering People First projects, it will give them an opportunity to put them through this filter and determine whether they are actually People First, viable, valuable, you know, identifiable type projects. Sorry, Ayopa, I forgot what the second question was. Can you remember that?
The sectors, most suitable sectors for People First PPP.
Okay. I think, you know, the ones that impact people the most are, you know, obviously this will be the healthcare, education type projects, but even certain transportation projects, if it leads to improvements in commerce and agricultural use. You know, you can think of, you know, in African countries where there are a lot of farmers that produce produce, but they have no way of putting it into cold storage and getting it down viable roads to markets for export. So, you know, in that sense, you know, they're producing goods, and sometimes a third to half of the goods or the produce that they produce is thrown away because it can't get to market. So, you know, anything that improves the lot or the situation of people, I think is a People First type project. I wouldn't consider, you know, building mega airports and, you know, which, and not a criticism, but, you know, big airlines have created international hubs like in Dubai, in Istanbul, and that's good for trade and commerce, and it's all about, you know, international travel and that, and it's good. And you could make the argument maybe that those are people first projects because they, you know, are connecting people and improving, you know, movement of people around the world. But I think in the post-COVID, you know, the smaller projects, you know, I'm talking about the 100, 150 million, $200 million projects that focus on healthcare, education, I mean, as much as your imagination goes, will help. And specifically, again, I'll stress transportation projects that give people access to markets or improve their movements. And I think what's also might happen with people first projects that will become more and more important is the whole idea of smart transport in cities, you know, where people are very concerned about environmental impacts of cities becoming more and more congested and the health impacts and what it does to people's health. And, you know, if they can find ways, you know, to, you know, improve people movement, access to transportation that's affordable and, you know, not massive scale, but light rail or, you know, smart modules that move around. I think those type of projects will also really fit the sort of the people first model.
Okay. There are two more questions, David, for you. The first one is, under the COVID, a lot of funding to PPP, especially for government contributions, milestone payments, have dried up. And any ideas of what new sources will be funding can be available for the PPP projects? This is the first question. And the second one is coming from Japan, from Setsuka. And as you know, we are discussing about flexibility of the legal frameworks and some of the contracts of PPP contracts. And she is asking about, did you find any example that PPP contracts were renegotiated to rebalance, to revenue guarantee? Do you know any flexibility contract during your survey? Because I know you discussed more than 200 PPP experts and some PPP officials from the PPP units of different countries. So did you know anything, any solid example in negotiation of governmental guarantees or flexibility of PPP contracts?
Yeah, and can you just remind me the first one again quickly, sorry?
The first question is about the new sources of funding can be available because, you know, because of the governmental guarantees problem. So how we will establish new PPP projects and not based on governmental guarantees? What do you think about the new sources of funding? Could be, for example, we are discussing in Tyras, you know, being a partner, equity partner of government into the SPV could be a new source of new PPP.
Yeah. So one thing that I've heard generally in Africa, for example, and I'm not sure if this is valid in other countries, but there are enormous pension funds that governments have established over the years, which are not being used as good investment tools. So I think one thing that governments could consider, for example, is using the money that they're sitting on in their pension funds to actually invest in PPP projects, especially in the sense if they are going to, you know, bring about change that is positive towards the country, you know, kind of the people first element. There are also a lot of green funds that are emerging that are going to be very interested in sustainable projects and resilient projects. So you have these impact investors that we need to explore and reach out to. But again, you're going to have to make the case to them because they have a very, very, how would you call it, strict idea of what they want to invest in. And so, you know, I think governments, if they're going to attract alternative funds, are going to have to listen more to investors and not tell investors to listen to them, if that makes sense. The World Bank and the IFC have also announced lots of new sort of funding sources or financial sources that are being made available. But what is interesting is more and more and more of them are being tied, you know, to achieving the sustainable goals, the sustainable development goals, you know, environmental type concerns. You know, the day of the World Bank investing in a large coal-powered, you know, power plant, it's gone. You know, so don't, as a country, try and say, you know, well, we want investment in this polluting type of infrastructure, that's not going to happen. But I think green funds, impact investment funds, they are also angel investors who are looking out there. And there's an International Angel Investors Forum. And I think they held a meeting in Istanbul earlier this year, where, if you look at angel investors, you look at the websites on that, they are also basically telling you what type of projects they're interested in investing in. And if you have that project, or governments can bring their mind about to fitting projects into those requirements, I think they are going to find what they need. The other is flexibility in PPP contracts. That's a really interesting concept. And I'm sorry, I apologize to lawyers, but who might be on this call, but many lawyers are trained or always trying to do ironclad, solid contracts. And I've always had a bit of a problem with that because, I don't know, and I'm sure Ayoub, you don't know, if I knew what the world was going to look like in 10 years time, 20 years time, 30 years time, I would be one of the wealthiest people around, because, the world changes, and it changes dramatically. And so what I think needs to take place with the clauses in contracts, obviously there are certain clauses, for risk that have to stay constant, construction risk, for example, should always be with the constructor. But when you start getting to operational risk and, that sort of consideration, I think we will need to be flexible and look at ways that clauses can be written that and I don't know how to do because I'm not a lawyer, but should the unexpected happen, that the contract does have an ability to discuss and change clauses. And this is important to ensure the survivability of a PPP project. The worst that can happen is if lawyers stand their ground and say, you are at fault, you are wrong, and because of that, you are going to, you have to pay, or you are going to be responsible, even in a situation like the COVID time, where these things were unexpected and were not anyone's fault. And that's the question. How do you have these contracts to be flexible that are not any specific party's fault? The other area that I think is going to be also important with flexibility in PPP contracts, contract clauses, is when we start entering into smart technology and, new IT types of things, is technological obsolescence. How do we, we're going to have to explore how we build that in, because there could be an innovation in 3 years' time or 5 years' time that completely detracts and destroys the project. I'll tell you a very interesting case study. I was in New Orleans once, and I was talking to the New Orleans Port Authority, and they came up with something that was a contract that was so inflexible that it took them 100 years to pay it off. And you might ask, what was that? And the reason was that there was a coal company that 100 years ago entered into an agreement with the Port Authority to provide coal for ships. And this was about 1917, 1918. Well, in 1917, 1918, almost every ship that was at sea used coal. And they got a 100-year contract to provide coal out of the port to ships. Well, by the 1930s and 1940s, ships were all converting to oil burners or oil furnaces. And so there was no need for coal anymore. Well, guess what? The Port Authority got stuck with that contract and had to meet their obligations, even though no coal was bought for maybe the last 50 years of the contract. They had to meet them for 100 years. So I think what needs to happen is lawyers, well, let's say not just lawyers, but the public sector, when they launch projects, need to stress, and this is where it ties into sustainable and resilient clauses in contracts that are flexible and that are adjustable so that the contract doesn't kill the project.
David, thank you very much. I have more questions, but we don't have much time to answer, to discuss this kind of questions. So I will forward you all questions and we will discuss. And maybe you would like to send all these questions from LinkedIn pages, maybe a blog.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for this very useful presentation and the results of your survey. we need all this kind of information regarding PPP in our future. So we are waiting for new projects from different countries. We are ready to develop reshape new PPP projects. So this year we define the main topic of our PPP week, reshaping PPP together. So I know we will find a way to do it. So thank you for all participants from different countries and entire the world. Thank you very much for your insightful presentation, David.
Thank you very much. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.